What if the biggest threat to Russia's hold on Crimea is not a single missile, a destroyed base, or even the Kerch Bridge, but the slow realization that keeping the peninsula may be becoming harder, more expensive, and more dangerous every month? Because a fortress does not have to be stormed to become a trap. Sometimes all it takes is for the roads in, the power supply, the fuel network, the railways, and the confidence of the people inside to become increasingly fragile. For years, Moscow presented Crimea as a symbol of strength. The 2014 annexation was portrayed inside Russia as a historic victory and a restoration of national power. Crimea was supposed to demonstrate that Russia could seize territory, integrate it, defend it, and turn it into a showcase of Russian prosperity. But there is a problem with every isolated peninsula. It depends on connections. Food has to arrive, fuel has to arrive, electricity has to move, industrial supplies have to move, military equipment has to move. Tourists and residents need roads, railways, and other transport links. And when several of those systems come under pressure at the same time, the question changes. It is no longer simply, was another facility hit? The more important question becomes, how much harder is it becoming to keep Crimea functioning? That distinction is crucial. Ukraine does not necessarily need Crimea to collapse overnight. A more subtle strategy would be to increase the cost and complexity of sustaining Russian control. Every disrupted transport route can create delays. Every damaged energy facility can reduce resilience. Every threatened fuel supply can increase costs. Every military target destroyed forces Russia to repair, replace, relocate, or protect something else. None of these events alone proves that Crimea is approaching collapse, but their cumulative effect is what matters, and this is where the story moves beyond the battlefield. Reports cited in the source material describe electricity restrictions and rotating outages in parts of Crimea, including Sevastopol. Power disruptions immediately affect civilian life, but their significance can extend further. Water systems, communications, businesses, refrigeration, transport infrastructure, and other essential services all depend on reliable energy. Military facilities also require power, although military infrastructure can have backup and priority systems. The real issue is therefore not whether one blackout suddenly disables the Russian military. It is whether repeated pressure forces the entire system to operate with less resilience and at greater cost. Then there is fuel. A military cannot function without fuel, and neither can a civilian economy. Trucks need it, generators need it, construction equipment needs it, transport depends on it. And on a peninsula, the number of major routes capable of moving large quantities of supplies is inherently limited. That makes the Kerch Bridge strategically important far beyond its physical size. It is a major connection between Crimea and Russia. It carries civilian and commercial traffic and has also been important to Russian logistics. When that connection is disrupted or placed under threat, the consequences can spread through the wider transportation system. But the most important question is not whether traffic is delayed for a few hours on a particular day. The real question is what happens when uncertainty becomes normal. A business cannot easily plan when deliveries may be delayed. A truck operator cannot operate efficiently when routes are unpredictable. Tourism suffers when travelers fear disruption. Families hesitate when they cannot be confident about transport, fuel, or basic services. And military planners have to account for the same uncertainty. That is why railway disruption matters too. Crimea's railway network is part of the peninsula's civilian and broader logistics infrastructure. When services are suspended, shortened, rerouted, or repeatedly disrupted, the consequences can extend beyond passengers. Cargo schedules become more complicated, transport takes longer, alternative routes become more important, and every additional complication increases the burden on a system already operating under wartime pressure. But then something even more important begins to happen. The crisis moves from infrastructure into psychology. Imagine you own a hotel in Crimea. Electricity becomes less reliable, fuel becomes more expensive, travelers become nervous about security, transport becomes uncertain, reservations begin disappearing. At some point, the question is no longer whether you can survive one difficult week. It becomes whether the business still makes sense. Now imagine you are a family with children. You hear reports of attacks. You see transport disruptions. You hear warnings about shortages or winter conditions. You have relatives elsewhere in Russia. You have enough money to leave. Do you wait until the situation becomes undeniably bad, or do you leave before everyone else does? That is where a logistics problem can become a confidence problem. The source material points to concerns about residents leaving, property being offered for sale, and pressure on tourism and local businesses. These reports do not prove that Crimea is experiencing an irreversible mass exodus, but they raise an important question. What happens when people stop believing that today's disruption is temporary? Because confidence can disappear faster than infrastructure can be rebuilt. A businessman sells his property, a family sends its children elsewhere, a tourist cancels a trip, a supplier avoids a difficult route. a business closes temporarily. Another family sees all of this and begins asking the same question. Maybe they know something we don't. That is how fear can spread, not through one spectacular event, but through thousands of small decisions. One of the more notable voices discussed in the source material is Alexander Gorny, a pro-Kremlin blogger who moved from Moscow to Crimea after the annexation and has previously promoted the peninsula's Russian future. His warnings about supply problems, economic pressure, and public dissatisfaction are significant precisely because they come from someone associated with the Russian side of the political narrative. But his predictions, including a warning focused on the end of September, should not be treated as a guaranteed deadline. Wartime predictions often fail. The more important point is what such warnings reveal. People are increasingly discussing the possibility of a serious deterioration rather than assuming that every disruption will simply disappear. And that creates a dangerous feedback loop. If enough people expect shortages, they buy supplies early. If enough businesses expect declining demand, they reduce investment. If enough residents expect worsening conditions, they consider leaving. If enough tourists stay away, businesses suffer. And if businesses suffer, confidence falls further. The result can be a territory that continues functioning while becoming progressively more expensive to sustain. That is why collapse may actually be the wrong word. The more useful word is degradation. Crimea does not have to become completely dark. Food does not have to disappear from every store. Trains do not have to stop permanently. Tourism does not have to fall to zero. Russia does not have to lose control of the peninsula tomorrow. Instead, imagine a different scenario. Power requires more emergency support. Fuel becomes more expensive. Transport becomes less predictable. Military facilities require greater protection. Damaged infrastructure needs constant repair. Businesses receive fewer customers. Tourism weakens. Residents become more nervous. Moscow responds with more subsidies, more security, and more resources. The system survives, but the cost of survival keeps increasing. And that creates the strategic dilemma facing Moscow. One option is stabilization. More money, more repairs, more generators, more security, and greater protection for critical infrastructure. Another is continued deterioration, more attacks, more logistical disruption, more economic pressure, more residents leaving, and greater military resources diverted toward protecting the systems that keep Crimea functioning. Neither scenario automatically produces Russian withdrawal, but both can make Crimea a more expensive strategic commitment. Then comes the factor that could expose the system's weaknesses even further: winter. Summer disruption is difficult. Winter raises the stakes. Electricity becomes more important. Heating becomes essential. Fuel becomes more critical. Infrastructure failures become harder for civilians to tolerate. That does not mean a winter crisis is inevitable. It means winter could become a test of resilience. Can Crimea keep its electricity supply reliable? Can fuel and food continue reaching the people who need them? Can essential civilian services keep functioning under growing pressure? Can Russia protect its military infrastructure while still maintaining the systems civilians depend on? And perhaps most importantly, can Moscow convince the population that conditions will actually get better? Because Russia can spend money, it can repair infrastructure, it can deploy security forces, it can reinforce military positions. What is much harder to manufacture is confidence. And that may be the real battlefield. Not whether Crimea falls tomorrow, but whether the peninsula gradually becomes a place that Russia must constantly supply, constantly defend, constantly repair, and constantly subsidize, while more people begin asking whether they should stay. That is the paradox. The same roads, railways, energy systems, and bridges that help Russia hold Crimea are also the systems civilians depend on to live there. The bridge is a military lifeline, but it is also a civilian escape route. The railway is a logistics network, but it is also a way for people to move. The power grid supports military infrastructure, but it also keeps homes, businesses, hospitals, and water systems functioning. So the real struggle may not be about destroying one piece of infrastructure. It may be about forcing Moscow to choose where its limited attention, money, protection, and repair capacity go first. And that is why the next months could matter. Not because one particular date guarantees a collapse, not because one attack will suddenly change everything, but because several pressures can accumulate.
Another disruption, another power crisis, another vital link in the logistics network was damaged, another rise in costs, another wave of cancellations, and another family quietly decides it may be time to leave. Individually, each event can be explained away. Together, they can change the psychology of an entire territory. So is Crimea collapsing? No, not on the evidence presented here. Russia still controls the peninsula and retains substantial resources to support it. But the more important question may be whether the cost of maintaining that control is steadily rising. Because a fortress can survive without comfort. It can survive without tourism. It can survive under military pressure. But there is a point where the people inside begin looking toward the only road out and asking a question that no government can answer with propaganda. How long will this place remain worth staying in? And if that question becomes widespread, Crimea's biggest problem may no longer be the next attack. It may be the loss of confidence that follows it. If you want more deeply researched geopolitical analysis without the usual noise, subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes the most important story is not the explosion everyone sees, it is the pressure building underneath it.